Hello and welcome to today's video. We're going to be looking at how to use the TI-84 Plus calculator to answer questions in the Study Island lesson called Function Inverses. And it's also going to be questions under the Algebra 2 Standard 2.1e. And so what I've done is I've gone into the Function Inverses lesson in Study Island and pulled out the questions that you can do solely using the graphing calculator. Just a little bit of information you're going to need to know to make it easier to answer these questions is that when you have a graph of the original function, which is blue here in this picture, the inverse of that function's graph, so if you were to graph the inverse, that's the red dotted graph here, is a reflection over this green dotted line, which is y equals x. So knowing that is one of the ways that we can use the calculator to answer these questions. So to recap, the original function's graph and the inverse of that original function's graph are reflections over the y equals x line. Okay, so here, this question doesn't fit on one screen, so just so you know, there are 4 choices. But the question gives us this function, x plus 5 over 2, and wants to know which of the following graphs represents the inverse of the function above. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn the calculator on, and I'm going to go into y equals and clear out everything that I have there. And I'm going to type my new function, which is x plus 5 over 2. So here's where I go to press x, right beside alpha, and then plus, and then anytime I have a fraction, just to make sure that calculator 100% understands that I have a fraction, I like to use parentheses at the beginning and end of that fraction. So I press parenthesis 5 divided by 2, and parenthesis, and that's how I enter in a fraction. And so now once I have the original function entered into y1, I'm going to press second quit to go back to the home screen, and I'm just going to clear everything out there. And then I'm going to tell the calculator to draw the inverse of y1. So I am going to go to where it says draw on the calculator, and since that's above a button in blue, I'm going to have to press second draw. And then scroll down, I see that option 8 says draw inverse. So you can either highlight the 8 and press enter, or just press 8. And so now I have to tell it what to draw the inverse of. So I wanted to draw the inverse of y1. So I'm going to have to go into vars, scroll over to y vars, make sure the 1's highlighted and press enter. And then I want y1 and the 1's highlighted, so I'm going to press enter. And so now I'm telling the calculator to draw the inverse of y1, and y1 is where I had put that x plus 5 over 2. So once I hit enter, it's going to go to the graph, and it's first going to graph the original function, and then it's going to graph the inverse. So it's that second graph that I'm looking for in my answer. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and there it's graphing the original, and then it graphed the inverse. And so this second line here that I graphed is the inverse. So I'm going to be looking for that line in my answer. And so, I mean, it could be W because it looks like it's going through 2 and 3, but it looks closer to 3 on the calculator. So let's see what other options we have. And here's another one. It's it's going through the x-axis between -2 and -3, so that's not right. Here it goes through the origin, so y and z aren't right. And then x, it goes through 0 and -1, so that's not right. So just go through between 2 and 3 on the x-axis, this inverse graph, and the only answer that has a graph that goes through the x-axis between 2 and 3 is W. So that's going to be my final answer for number 1. The next question I have is very similar. I'm just going to have to go back into y equals and clear out what I have in y1. I'm going to have to type in my new function here. So this is a fraction, and so to show that the whole x plus 1 is the numerator, I'm going to put parentheses around x plus 1. And since there's nothing before and after the fraction, I don't have to do parentheses over the entire fraction like I did with 5 over 2 in the last problem. So this is how I would enter this one, is I'd put a parenthesis, x plus 1, end parenthesis, divide, and then I go ahead and put parentheses around the 3, 2 to show that that is the denominator. And so once again, I'm going to tell it to draw the inverse, but to help me to remember which graph is the original, which one's the inverse, I'm going to go ahead and make this original one a thicker line. So that's going to, and I do that by highlighting this line, blinking over here to Y1, and pressing enter once. And you can now see that that line looks thicker than the ones below it, so that means that when it goes to graph, the original is going to be a thicker line. So now I just follow the same steps. I'm going to go into second, draw, choice 8, and then vars, y vars, enter, enter. And then I'm going to press enter, and that first thicker line's the original. And then that second line, the skinnier line there, is going to be the inverse. And so I'm looking for a pretty steep line that's increasing. So W here is increasing, but that one is kind of flatter than what I see on the graph. And it crosses the y-axis, W, above 0, between 0 and 1, and this one crosses below 0, so it's somewhere in the negative, so I know it can't be W. X is decreasing. I need a line that's increasing. Y, that's curves, so it can't be Y. And then Z here crosses the y-axis at -1, which looks about right on my graph here. And so that means Z, choice C, is going to be my final answer. The next question here gives us two functions and wants to know if they're inverses or not. There's two ways that you can do this problem, and I'm going to show you how to do both ways, but you can just pick one and do it that way, whatever one you're more comfortable with. And also a heads up to make these easier, if it is an inverse, then this one here is going to be your reason. Okay, this answer here, inverse, is because with the not equal sign, can never be an answer. It just doesn't make sense. That's never a reason for an inverse. So D will never be an answer. So you can rule that out. And then the not inverses can't have the one with the two equal signs. That's never a reason it's not an inverse. It's a reason it is an inverse, not an inverse. So B here is never going to be a reason answer ever. So that means A and C are the only ones here that could be an answer. So that just helps you to get the question down to 50-50. So to go ahead and do this, I'm going to go into y equals and put both these functions into y1 and y2. So like I said before, and we're going to show you two ways, and this is going to be the first way. So here I have a fraction 1 over x, so I'm going to put that in parentheses, 1 divided by x, in parentheses, plus 2. And then I'm going to scroll down and put in my g of x, which is 1 over x in parentheses, minus 2. And so once again, to help me keep track of which one's which, I'm going to make this second one a thicker line by scrolling over in front of y2. And then pressing enter once to make a thicker line show up in front of y2. And so now I'm going to go back to the home button. And you can do that by pressing second quit, and I'm going to press clear. And then I'm going to press second draw. And it's going to be the 8th choice is the draw inverse, so I'm going to press 8. And then I need to put in y1, so I'm going to go to vars, scroll over to y vars. Function is highlighted, so I press enter, and I want y1, so I press enter again. And so now when it graphs it, it's going to graph f of x first, then g of x, and then the inverse. So if the inverse graphs right on top of g of x, then I'm good. I know that that's a function. I know that those are inverses. So I'm going to go ahead and press graph, or press enter. And there's my first one. There's my second one, g of x. And there is my inverse. So you can see I had 3 different graphs drawn. And the second 2 were not exactly on top of each other. So these are going to be not inverses because of this f of g of x does not equal x. The second way that you could do that is by going into y equals and making y3 equal to x. And that's going to show you what it should be reflected over. So if I go ahead and graph that, here, first let me clear this all out and press y equals so that it doesn't, and then I'm going to do zoom standard, which is 6, and that clears up your graph so it regraphs everything. And so what that does is it gives me that y equals x line that those 2 graphs should be reflections of. And so when I look at that, if I were to fold this graph over the y equals x line, those graphs wouldn't line up. They wouldn't be reflections of each other. So it's not going to be inverses, so my answer is still A. Like I said, you can use either method, just pick the one that you are most comfortable with and stick with it. So number 4 here is going to be the same procedure. I'm going to go into y equals, and I'm going to clear out everything I have here. And then I'm going to type in my 2 functions. So into y1, I'm going to type f of x, which is x squared minus 8x plus 21. And then into y2, I'm going to type g of x, which is the second square root of x minus 5. That's everything that's under the square root, so I'm going to scroll out of it and put a plus 4. And then that's it, but however, I want to help myself know which one's which when I'm looking at the graph, so I'm going to change a g of x or y2 to a thicker line. So I highlight the line and press enter to make it flash a thicker line. And then I'm going to do that first way that I showed you in the last problem. I'm going to go into second draw, choice 8, and then vars, y vars, enter, enter. And I'm going to have it draw the inverse of y1. So first when I press enter here, it's going to graph f of x, then g of x, and then the inverse. And so if it graphs the inverse right over g of x, then I'm good. That's going to be they're going to be inverses. If not, then they will not be inverses. So let's press enter and find out. So there goes my first. There goes my second. And then it graphed the inverse right over g of x. And so there was this extra part here. However, it only cares about the functions from positive 5 to infinity. So it only cares about that piece here where it graphed over it. So that means these are going to be functions, which is choice D, where it has the correct reason for being functions. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.